The flames caught his skin before he could scream. One moment he was a king, resting beneath the warmth of healing linen. The next he was a torch, lit by mistake, consumed by arrogance. It was not war, nor poison, nor a calculated blade that took him. It was fire, fire born of ignorance, superstition, and desperation. A monarch reduced to ash by the very people sworn to preserve him. Charles II of Navarre, known across Europe as Charles the Bad, died in such a horrific manner that even his enemies flinched. Chroniclers would later argue whether his death was divine justice or cruel misfortune. But the fact remains, this was a man who had spent a lifetime sowing terror, betrayal, and blood, and in the end died screaming into his own skin. To understand his final agony, we must return not just to the moment of his death, but to the mindset of a fading king. By the winter of 1387, Charles was no longer the cunning, charismatic noble who once dared to challenge the thrones of France and England. He was a shell, ravaged by age, guilt, and disease. His body, once armored in velvet and steel, was now frail and bloated. His legs trembled when he stood. His teeth had long since rotted out. His breath stank of infection and fermented wine. Court physicians tried every known remedy: bloodletting, herbal compresses, leeches, prayer. Nothing eased his pain. He grew paranoid, convinced that ghosts of the men he had poisoned were haunting his sleep. He muttered curses in Latin and feared touching his own children. According to an anonymous monk writing in the Chronicon Navaricum, Charles was a man already rotting before death touched him. So they tried something desperate: brandy. Not to drink, but to soak. Physicians, driven by fading knowledge and misplaced confidence, suggested a full-body wrapping of linen bandages soaked in warm alcohol. The belief was that brandy would draw out disease through the skin and ignite the king's spirit. It was the latest miracle treatment in a time where medicine blurred with magic. They wrapped his arms, legs, and chest. They doused the bandages repeatedly, sealing in the liquid with layers of wool and gauze. For hours he lay immobile, nearly mummified. The chamber reeked of booze and antiseptic herbs, but the final step was still to come: sealing the wrappings with gentle warmth, often done by passing a candle near the edges to bake in the brandy. It was supposed to be symbolic, a touch of fire to rekindle the flame of life. What they didn't calculate was the flammability of undiluted alcohol. The night of Charles's death began in utter stillness. Outside, the winds howled through the towers of Pamplona's royal palace, carrying the cold scent of snow and distant pine. Inside, within the dimly lit royal chambers, a deathbed ritual unfolded beneath flickering torchlight. Charles lay still, wrapped in layers of dampened linen. His bandages clung to his flesh, soaked with brandy, herbs, and the final hopes of desperate physicians. The smell in the room was thick: brandy, sweat, rotting flesh, incense. His face, once sharp and charismatic, had sunken into itself. He looked more corpse than king. A young nurse named Isabel, barely 16, had been summoned to assist. She carried with her a small beeswax taper candle. Her hands trembled as she approached the bed. She had been instructed to seal the wraps, pass the flame along the outer edges just briefly to warm the linen and stimulate circulation. It was a common practice in folk medicine, nothing more than ceremony really, but no one had warned her of the potency of the brandy. She hesitated at the foot of the bed. Charles's breathing was shallow, raspy. His eyes opened just a slit, murky and bloodshot. A wet, gurgling sound escaped his throat. Whether it was breath or speech, no one could tell. Isabel swallowed, nodded at the physician standing by, and lowered the flame toward the cloth. In a heartbeat, the king erupted into fire. The linen burst like dry parchment. Flames raced up his limbs, across his chest, engulfing his face in a flash of orange and blue. Charles's body arched violently Slowly, his mouth opened wide, and then a scream. It was not the cry of a man. It was a sound raw and primal, like an animal being butchered alive. The walls echoed with the shriek. Tapestries rustled. A goblet fell from a tray in the hallway outside. "Fire! Fire in the chamber!" a voice roared. Servants burst in. One guard dropped to his knees, frantically throwing furs onto the bed. Another grabbed a basin of water and hurled it blindly at the flames. Isabel was shoved aside, her face streaked with tears, her hands burned. Smoke filled the room. The smell, charred skin, alcohol, and human fat, was unbearable. Charles flailed, his voice broken into rasps and choking gasps. The linens fused to his skin, tearing it as they peeled away. His hair was gone. His eyes swelled shut. He trembled violently until his nerves failed him and only twitching remained. It took them several minutes to extinguish the flames. The silence that followed was worse than the chaos. The physician approached the bed. Charles was still breathing, barely. His mouth moved, whispering something no one could understand. The only word anyone later claimed to recognize was simply cold. They carried him to another chamber. For 6 hours he drifted in and out of delirium. Priests offered last rites. An apothecary poured poppy syrup down his throat. He choked on it. Soot blackened his nostrils. His fingertips fell away when touched. He died just before dawn. There was no public announcement, no ceremonial mourning. His remains, what little there were taken to the royal chapel, sealed away and forgotten. Isabel vanished from the records. The attending physician left court within a week. The chamber where it happened was bricked over, and so ended the life of Charles II of Navarre, not by war, nor poison, nor politics, but by a final blinding mistake. A king consumed by fire, alone, unloved, and utterly broken. Charles was born in Evreux, Normandy, in 1332. The eldest son of Philip III of Navarre and Joan II of Navarre. Through his mother, he was a direct descendant of Louis X of France, making him not only a prince, but a potential king of one of Europe's most powerful realms. This royal bloodline gave Charles a sense of entitlement from birth. Even as a child, he was told he deserved more than what he had. His upbringing was lavish, but also deeply political. The court of Navarre was a tense place, a small but strategic kingdom, sandwiched between the warring giants of France and Castile. Charles grew up surrounded by nobles, diplomats, and spies. He learned to speak Latin, French, Castilian, and Occitan before he was 10. He studied law, theology, and alchemy. He was not physically strong, but he was intelligent, observant, and already manipulative. By his teens, Charles was being groomed not just to rule Navarre, but to disrupt Europe. His tutors drilled into him the stories of his ancestors, Capetian kings, crusaders, conquerors. He became obsessed with reclaiming what he saw as his rightful place on the French throne, and he wasn't alone. Many nobles in northern France, disillusioned by the rising Valois dynasty, viewed Charles as a potential alternative. In 1349, his father died suddenly. Some whispered it was poison, and Charles ascended to the throne at just 17. Young, sharp-tongued, and burning with ambition, he immediately set his sights beyond his modest kingdom. Navarre was too small. He wanted France. He began cultivating alliances, secret meetings with English envoys, lavish gifts to disgruntled French lords, whisper campaigns accusing King John II of France of illegitimacy. Charles didn't just challenge the Valois, he undermined them. One of his most audacious moves came in 1354. The King of France had named a powerful noble, Charles de la Cerda, as Constable of France, effectively the king's right hand. But de la Cerda was also negotiating to marry into the Castilian royal family and absorb lands that bordered Navarre. Charles saw him as both a personal and political threat, so he had him killed. The assassination was brutal. De la Cerda was ambushed by a group of knights loyal to Navarre and stabbed repeatedly in the head. His body was left in a ditch near Lael. It sent shockwaves through the French court. King John II was furious, but Charles played the game well. He feigned ignorance, offered temporary peace, and even visited Paris under the tense of diplomacy. Behind the scenes, he was already negotiating with Edward III of England, offering territory, troops, and loyalty in exchange for English support for his claim to the French crown. 1356, his duplicity finally caught up to him. King John II invited him to a feast, then had him arrested and imprisoned at the Chateau d'Arleux. Most assumed he'd be executed, but Charles was no ordinary prisoner. He bribed guards, forged messages, and stirred unrest in Navarre. Within a year, he escaped either through trickery or sheer chaos. He returned to Navarre as a legend. His people celebrated him. Rebels in France whispered his name. English envoys arrived with gold and promises. He was no longer a minor king. He was now a political storm. Charles would continue this pattern for decades, making and breaking alliances, betraying anyone who stood in his way, and always reaching higher. But the higher he climbed, the more enemies he made, and soon Navarre would begin to feel the weight of his ambition. Back in Navarre, Charles ruled like a man with a ticking clock inside his chest. His ambition had not cooled. It had metastasized into obsession. The throne of France had eluded him, but he wasn't finished. If he couldn't wear the French crown, he would make it bleed. He reorganized his court into a fortress of informants. No meal was served without being tasted. No letter left the palace without being opened. Ministers were rotated weekly to prevent conspiracy. His inner circle consisted of alchemists, astrologers, and professional spies. He believed the stars foretold betrayal and poison whispered through walls. At night, he reportedly walked the halls in silence, eavesdropping on servants. Some claimed he wore a hood, so even guards wouldn't recognize him. He kept a personal ledger of names, those loyal, those suspicious, and those marked for death. In 1360, he began a brutal purge of Navarrese nobles who had grown too independent. Men who had once fought for him were arrested in the middle of the night, their estates seized, their families banished. One baron, Pierre de Belzunce, was accused of treason without trial and publicly dismembered. His tongue was nailed to the castle gate in Pamplona with a plaque reading, "The price of false counsel." These weren't random executions, they were warnings. By 1371, trade routes into Navarre began to collapse. Merchants feared the kingdom. Neighboring rulers placed embargoes. The people starved, but Charles refused to adjust his taxes. When riots broke out in Tudela, he sent the army to burn the town granary and hang the organizers. Then came the rebellion. In 1373, a coordinated uprising exploded in Pamplona. Citizens rallied around a disgraced nobleman named Martin de Arellano, who had secretly been exiled by Charles years prior. The city turned on the king's tax collectors. Charles's standard was torn from the city gate. He responded with overwhelming cruelty. Within days, his mercenaries stormed the city. They dragged rebels from their homes and executed them in the main square. Women and children were herded into churches and locked in without food for days. Arellano was captured, stripped naked, and flayed alive on the steps of the citadel. His skin was turned into a drum. Charles stood at a balcony above the square as it happened. According to a court scribe, he never blinked. But while his enemies bled, so did his alliances. France had grown tired of his manipulations. England no longer trusted him. His name became a curse in every European court. Even within Navarre, whispers spread. The king practiced dark arts, that he kept a room of preserved organs in jars, that his mother had cursed him on her deathbed. People claimed the land itself rejected him. Storms came early. Wolves prowled the countryside. Fields failed to bloom. The once proud Charles of Navarre was now a king of ash and fear, his kingdom hollowed by greed, and his legacy written in blood. By the early 1380s, Charles's body was no longer simply aging. It was collapsing. He had grown grotesquely bloated, especially in the abdomen. His legs oozed fluid when touched. His gums bled nightly. He could no longer walk unassisted. Sometimes his fingers locked into twisted positions for hours. Court physicians blamed it on dropsy, palsy, poison. No one truly knew. He began speaking in riddles. His sleep was plagued with hallucinations. One courtier swore they saw him sit up suddenly and scream, "They're burning already before falling back into unconsciousness. His nights were soaked in sweat. His servants rotated shifts so that no one would have to stay with him for too long. Medical treatments turned increasingly desperate. Crushed emeralds dissolved in vinegar, enemas of mint and sulfur. One physician prescribed boiled wolf flesh mixed with fig syrup. Another insisted he be bled daily to drain corrupted royal humors. But none of it helped. If anything, the treatments worsened his state. His skin changed color, gray, then greenish near his feet. Black spots emerged on his back. His eyes began to cloud over as though decay was setting in before death. The court grew paranoid. Murmurs of black magic swept the palace. Charles had once kept occultists in his court. Now people feared they had cursed him. A priest was summoned to bless the palace every morning with holy water. Women made the sign of the cross before entering his chamber. Some claimed that when he passed gas, it smelled like sulfur and smoke. Charles himself grew increasingly obsessed with omens. He asked for star charts. He paid an astrologer to recalculate his birth sign. When a comet passed in early 1387, he demanded all his mirrors be covered. On one occasion, he reportedly ordered a peasant girl to be executed because she had red hair and looked like the devil. Desperate for relief, he finally allowed his physicians to attempt a radical remedy. The idea was to seal him in warmth, to purge his illness from the inside. The method, a full-body bandage soaked in warmed brandy and herbs. He agreed without protest. He had already lost his voice. When they began wrapping him, he wept silently. The treatment took hours. He lay motionless, eyes wide, mouth slack. His body barely moved. Only the shallow rise of his chest marked time. Then came the nurse. Then came the flame. And everything that followed would sear itself into legend. News of his death spread quickly. In Paris, some celebrated. In Pamplona, bells rang with joy, not sorrow. Froissart called him a man of great duplicity. Others said he was born only to destroy. His dynasty faded. His tomb went forgotten. But Charles II of Navarre is still remembered, not for glory, not for wisdom, but for fire, for betrayal, and for a scream that echoed down a hallway of stone where pride met flame and a king was reduced to ash. If this dark corner of history fascinated you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true stories that textbooks left buried. Let us know in the comments which twisted ruler should we uncover next.